So this week we will be continuing in our third week of the Christmas story series, where we are exploring different Christmas narratives and reimagining how they can help us picture the story of Advent and the coming of Jesus here on earth. This week we will be having a shared conversation where we talk about the different concepts that Advent brings and what they mean personally to us as a group.
As we've been walking through this last season of Advent, which is the time of the coming, to where the community gets to sit between the first coming, where Jesus becomes incarnate, where God chooses to be embodied rather than to be distant, and the second coming, we find that our imagination for the second coming, which historically the church has centered around December, to say that we must start meditating on, thinking about, anticipating the hope, peace, joy, and love, which will define the second coming. It's shaped our imagination. So in this time, in this season, because calendars have always been a part of us keeping track of holy times and thin spaces to where when we sit together, we imagine together, we can shape towards a more beautiful, equitable, and gracious future. But we take these intentional moments of seasons and calendars to make sure that we tell the sacred stories together in order to start reimagining what they could be for an expanding community. As we've seen over the last few weeks, to where we're taking different passages from the scripture to be able to meditate on these things, it's stirred up different ways for us to sit between those two tensions, the two comings, the two advents, and to try to reimagine what it looks like in this moment to be an Advent community. Like, I have to admit that Advent was always kind of distant in my head because although I was raised around the church, the only spot I usually heard it was something to do with some weird end time philosophy to where we knew things were going to rise. And so I heard about a second coming, a second Advent. And my grandmother, who was Episcopalian, so she does nothing else with the church, but she remembers some of the high holy days. So to me, it was always presented as this strange otherness from within my own tradition because we heard about it. It was distant, but it wasn't something that we marked time by. Like part of my lower church model Pentecostal heritage is we thought only the immediate mattered, only the fresh, the last few months, maybe the last years, that anointing that means God shall interact with us, which is very important in the season. But the longer historical continuation of all the people saying that we sit between the two comings wasn't real for us. We had no memory with only the immediate. And once in a while it bled over. We kind of co-opted the term from another tradition. Like, yes, we heard this. It's something about the devil coming to earth and the book of Revelation. Daniel comes up somewhere in Advent. That sounds authoritative.
Advent for me, I kind of have a similar background to Glenn. I grew up in a small Pentecostal churches. I also grew up in a predominantly Hispanic church, and I'm not. I can't say whether across Hispanic churches all over whether Advent is a big thing or not, but I just know for our little Hispanic Pentecostal church, it definitely wasn't. Um, I was reflecting on it recently, and I remembered that. So we went through many pastors at that church. They were constantly leaving and going for different reasons, and there was a season where we had a white couple that came to be our pastors, and there was definitely a lot of cultural differences that we had to work through. But they brought in the idea of Advent for the very first time for our community. And I remember the pastor's wife every Sunday would get up and light these candles and talk about some theme, and we had never heard of even the word Advent. I think the word Advent kind of felt like an intimidating word because it was just so foreign to a lot of the community. But the terms that she would talk about, such as peace, hope, joy, love, those we understood, and it honestly I tuned out a lot because I was in high school and those words just sounded like words that you put up on bathroom decor. It didn't really mean a lot to me. It was kind of that like live, laugh, love sort of feel. Um, and I totally forgot about the word Advent until after I finished my bachelor's degree. I was speaking with a old classmate of mine, and they were talking about how they were doing like this Advent devotional. And then the word started to mean more to me after I had learned more things. I had a little bit of education to have that word kind of have some weight. So since then, it's been slowly becoming a really beautiful way to experience the story of Christmas. Um, I've been recently kind of thinking about the difference of Advent as meaning the coming of something. So, kind of that anticipation or that theme of waiting, but also Advent as the word or meaning arrival. So, in a sense, there's also a waiting that's attached to Advent, but there's also a focus of things that are here, things that have come, things that are present. So, I think it can have that future and present weight to it as well. But that's sure. So peace, man, that's a hot commodity that I would love to experience more of. When I think of peace, it almost feels like a foreign word sometimes, because for me personally, peace is definitely a mental and emotional experience. I know peace can be experienced it in an external way, like you could have you could be in moments of danger or not have safety, but then there could be moments where that subsides and then you have peace. But there's also the internal experience of that. um, and I think this year alone, just with the amount of things that happen, I think both the outside and inside have just been uh, a place where not much peace has been experienced. And if you ever struggle with mental illness or any way, or if you just consider yourself an overthinker or someone who is very anxious, peace can seem like a very sort of elusive concept that you're constantly trying to grab for. But your brain almost always gets in the way. So I think peace is something that's heavily conditioned upon your connection to community. Uh, I think peace is something that is experienced communally. You can have sort of this contentment in being alone and being with yourself, but the experience of true peace, I think, comes when you not only have an external safety, but this acceptance and sense of belonging and the comfort that comes with that. There's kind of an ease your soul will slip into. So those are my kind of thoughts for peace. I know for me, just mental peace would be something that would be a great thing to experience after this year and just the chaos that we've all been going through. I know that's kind of a sort of more raw or not as happy answer for peace, but I know sometimes that just can be the reality for many of us.
But I think your reflection on peace is very timely for this season, because I think like on one sense, like as like creation is experiencing a certain level of peace in a sense because we had to actually like when we had to shut down, right? So one, I think we're reminded of that notion of rest that comes with peace. Uh, and so just listening to the way you're explaining it, but in the midst of that piece, like we're a society that's so committed to busyness, especially in North America, that when we have those stoppages, when we have those rest moments, it's actually experienced as hostility versus hospitality to the soul, right? And so we're actually searching for, like, as we come to the season, when we talk about mental health and things like that, like we're actually having to have another conversation around peace, even though like this season for a lot of people, from an external point of view, has been a kind of peace, a season where we were thrust into peace, but then out of that peace came a whole lot, like especially in America, with the just everything that was happening in America, whether like politically and socially and things like that, you had this massive upheaval that came out of that peace. And so it's just, I find it interesting that during this season, during the season, that like just the way that it's playing out, and just what is actually needed now coming into a new season where we can understand a renewed sense of peace, or like I would say, at least like when I'm hearing what you're saying, it really connects to the idea of new creation for me, right? Like where we're being called into that, we're being called to cultivate that kind of a space together, and as we do that, we see new life emerge out of that peace.
So, as we step into this notion of peace, also, I think we need to elevate peace a little bit because often we make peace the kind of like when you're in a dysfunctional relationship, you think peace is just not active fighting. So we can have peace framed as, because we didn't have peace within the States, being an American, being raised in the system. What we had is less protest. What we had was um, invisible systems running as expected. So no one gets upset when peace means social narratives play out in expected roles. The peace then gets violated when systems are exposed to show inequality, unrest, incivility. And I'd say if we look at, especially what you brought last week when you showed the kind of deconstructing the Christmas narrative we have in Luke, he brought peace, but the peace was an area for human flourishing, not a place of no tension. Because at the very Christ event of the Jesus coming, um, being brought into a low social economic household, saying the king is here to the shepherds when they already have a king just 50 miles away from that um, manger scene. The fact that we bring it into a household and out of an inn, and we root it within families and systems and say, this is peace because it's about human flourishing. So in the same way the Gospel of John brings us from the pre-incarnate into the incarnate reality, the same way Luke situates us not just in an incarnate reality, but in the least of us. We get this call towards peace, which is about whole human flourishing. So I think our lack of peace, our lack of ability to step into peace, to care about the overall well-being of each other, has caused a lot of the struggle we have right now. Because we say, give me peace, but what we mean is give me the absolute right to do only what is good for me. Do not demand that I think of the whole system. Do not demand that I think of those who cannot afford to take time off. Make sure that me and mine do not experience tension, and that is peace. When I think this is that reminder that peace exists to the degree that each person within the community can experience flourishing as opposed to just quietness.
Yeah, I love where you're going with that, Glenn. But it's interesting because I'm hearing you, and I agree with what you're saying for sure. But I kind of look at it as like there's a certain sense of privilege to understand peace that way, because I think somebody who is marginalized or oppressed, uh, like that doesn't feel like peace for them, and so they're like, even like the notion of peace is what's good for me. I don't think that's the questions necessarily that the oppressed and marginalized are necessarily asking. It's definitely the way that the privileged within society understand peace. And it's almost like the notion, it'd be like the difference between like that Pax Romana, like we want the status quo because it offers us a certain level of we are normalized, we are privileged. And then where the rest of the world, the people who are marginalized, or the 2/3 world, or however language that people throw out there, it's like we're actually looking for shalom. We're looking for a complete reordering of society that allows for human flourishing to come about, right? So I feel like it's almost like what like where do we pull our definition of peace from? Is it from more the Pax Romana type idea, or do we pull it more from the shalom and the restoration of creation as we move forward?
Yeah, but I would say that at least what I said wouldn't. I could see how you would hear some notion of privilege there, but I can say I've experienced that within multiple different communities of different degrees of location away from um, the normative. That it's the idea of passing. Like if I pass or go by the expected, which is why I played a little bit with the expected society norms. Because when we have peace as it's good enough, I pass right now. So um, peace is the lack of conflict.
Again, I would just say that's squarely rooted in a sense of privilege to be able to, like, if, as a person of color, if you're able to pass in a society, in a white, in a white dominated Eurocentric society, right, you're still moving into a sense of privilege because majority of people of color cannot pass, right? So they're like, it's still centered around privilege. That's so just someone like as someone who experiences society from that perspective. That's just how I heard it. Like I just it's like, oh, I don't have the privilege to actually ask that. Like you know what I mean. So that's just how I heard it personally. So it wasn't even a comment on what you were saying or even how you were saying it. It was just interesting because I agree with what you're saying, but I'm like also like, that's just not a question that I think I can come to the conversation with based on the way that I've experienced normalcy within society. Like normalcy has never been a good thing for me.
I I think after listening to both of you, the phrase that pops into my head, especially after this year, is no justice, no peace. And I think even in this conversation, I'm recognizing how the idea of peace has changed and should continue to change for me, in the sense that it really should be connected to some sort of justice. I don't know why growing up I just never would have described it that way, but I think after all the things that we've experienced, realizing now that peace has to come with a sense of justice for everyone, that true that peace is an active word. We think of peace as like, okay, I'm in the forest, there's no sound, I'm away from society, I hear the birds chirping, I can sleep, I can relax. But that's not what being a peacemaker is. Being someone who is advocating and fighting, whether it is for you or on behalf of someone else. So I definitely think peace should be connected to that in our brains, whether it is from someone who is lacking that peace, lacking that sense of justice in their life, or the people who need to disturb the peace, because the peace is inherent to the peace is injustice. It's not real peace.
I like that play you have, especially for this Advent season, of that we often imagine peace as the escape from. But that also comes with some of Carl's critique of notions of privilege, because it's only peace to live in the forest if you go there for a weekend. It's a retreat. It's not something you have to live in. It allows you some escapism. Then we come back to whatever securities we already have. That you have that call away from, or the Advent invitation, which is to root yourself in. You can't escape, because if God moved from the distant to the present, from the pre-incarnate to a manger, then we're also called to not just seek the forest, but actually sit with the people.
With like the theme of hope for me, especially like in light of Christmas, um, there was a story that I remember my teacher telling me when I would have been like grade school, I think grade 6 or 7, and we were studying like World War I, and they talked about like that one scene that probably all of us have heard, like where the Allied forces and the German forces, Christmas Day hit, and they ended up coming out and they played soccer and gave each other gifts and all that kind of. And as soon as Christmas was over, there was this notion of they went back to their respective sides and began to slaughter each other again, right? Like that's I was like, it was just always this really weird story that was told within the notion of World War I, but reason why I bring that up in the notion of hope is that like there's this call that I think there's this beckoning. Hope is this almost like it's the invitation of the future, the calling of the future, calling us forward, Christ calling us into the future with him. And the reason I bring that story up is that in the midst of war, in the midst of the chaos, there was something that spoke to these soldiers that said, hey, let's put these things aside. And it would have been interesting because to me at least, it shows a glimpse that humanity, even in the midst of war, in the midst of the chaos, in the midst of the no like the lack of peace that we can experience, when we're able to actually tap into that notion of hope, like we could actually bring about something more beautiful together. And imagine if like that's something that goes beyond just like a cessation of hostilities for a day, but we could actually think about that in this notion of what does new creation, new humanity, what does a reordering of the cosmos look like in order to actually bring about justice. And so for me at least, like when I think of hope and I think of Christmas and I think of like hope in light of Advent, there's this notion of the universe. What is it? Martin Luther King Jr. is famous for saying that like the moral arc of the universe is long and it's bent towards justice. And I think he's quoting somebody else, but like there's this I think Advent reminds me of that. Like there's this hope that even in the midst of all of this chaos, in the midst of like 2020 has been a really crappy year, there's still something hopeful that's beckoning us into the future. There's still something hopeful that is being projected from the future into now, and hope allows me to see it as hospitality versus hostility in this season.
For me, hope is definitely one of those abstract terms that like I know the meaning of it, but still even trying to like define it and explain like what that is and feels like for all of us is really hard. I always think of it as like the thing that's used in stories, where it's the one thing that the villain doesn't want the protagonists or the good guys to have. There's always some line where it's like, we got to make sure that they don't have hope, or else they'll win, or I won't be able to keep my power and control them if they don't have hope. Like that's the scariest thing to them, is the good guys having just even an ounce of hope, because they know as long as there's an ounce of hope, then their control or their agenda, their plan is not as secure. Um, and I think that's such a beautiful thing. It's like, how powerful hope can be. Even just an ounce of it can keep a struggling person going for a long time. And it's something that I think we crave as humans. We crave this sort of, having something to believe in, that the future could be better, that there is a possibility for things to be different. Um, but I also realized that, especially if you grew up in the church or in a lot of Christian spaces, sometimes there can be this environment where you're almost forced to be hopeful. And that you're kind of expected, like, oh, because you're a Christian, you should have this hope and people should see this hope. And that's how other people are going to come to faith, because they see just how hopeful you are. Um, but I really think that forcing yourself to experience hope can be dangerous, and forcing others to be in a place of hope. I think it's powerful when it's authentic and when it's real. And sometimes it may take time to actually find that authentic hope. It doesn't just come automatically. I think we kind of just want it to appear because we have this faith. But sometimes I think it takes time for it to appear and grow. I don't know if that makes sense.
Just it was interesting, just a thought that I had based on what you were sharing, especially when you're talking about like kind of like the villain and the need to extinguish hope, because as long as there's an ounce of hope, people can keep going. And I couldn't help but think about it from like the flip side, almost like with a Marxist kind of critique perspective of like like religion is the opiate of the masses, and maybe to say like, well, hope is the opiate of the masses. It's the actual thing that stops people from rising up to actually change their circumstances, in a sense, right? Like it's like they can keep going and they can keep surviving, they can keep existing in in conditions that are not ideal, because they have hope that those conditions could change. And it's just, so when you were sharing that, I don't know why, like that was the thought that kind of came in. It was like, oh, like I wonder, like if sometimes when we talk about hope, we actually use it as a tool of oppression versus a tool of subversion, right? And so like it's like I think of like the Black Lives Matter movement and things that are happening around us right now, where it's like there's this hope that the way the government is now, the way society is now, it could change. Like, so a lot of people are walking into it's like, well, like we don't need to abolish the police, we don't need to do these different things, we don't need to change things drastically, we just need them to be better. And so there's a hope that they could just be better, versus the whole system actually needs to be dismantled, and a new system needs to come in its place. And so like on one sense, like an authentic hope would be like a new world is actually possible. A disingenuous hope would be, well, things are bad, but hey, they could change, and I could experience the privileges of this oppressive system at some point. And it's just interesting, like that juxtaposition of like when you talk about genuine hope versus experiencing hope from some other kind of perspective. So it was just I don't know why that was like that Marxist critique that kind of popped in my head.
I was like, and I like that movement you drew, especially if you're looking back to what Carl said, not this last time, but the previous, is that idea that Christmas showed a crack in the overdetermined system of war, when they could pause and say, for this moment, we're not enemies, even if the next day you return to being enemies. And sometimes you're right, we do have hope as opiate, which is, um, wouldn't it be nice if all of us could be rich? Wouldn't it be nice if we don't struggle anymore? Almost going to that old Beach Boys song. Wouldn't it be nice if we were older and we didn't have to wait so long? But we get that kind of thing to where hope becomes this cute escapism again. But if we look at towards the real, the Christmas, the Advent hope in the midst of World War I, you couldn't have that moment unless it was painted on such a bleak background. And hope to me, especially within Advent season, where at least from what the stories I was raised on, was that God is embarrassed of you. that God, because of your sin, God has to get as far away from you as possible. And it's for your own good, because if he was in your presence, he'd have to whoop your ass. And that would just be bad. So he's escaping you for your own good because you make him mad. Um, Towards the hope of Advent, which it said that the light shined in the darkness and the darkness could not overcome. And that same verb of overcoming there is then later used that by the desire of God, all those who would trust him would receive, and it uses that same verb of lambano for both of those. One is the grasping, overwhelming; the other one, those who are willing to receive their place because you were desired. That is this hope that there's a crack in the overdetermined system, that it's not inevitable. We're not going to have to always march in the streets, even though we see the signs now that said I was marching in the 60s. Why do I still have to march today? It is not inevitable. There is change, and it is possible to actually affect the narrative, to bend it, as Carl said, towards justice, towards peace. And that's the hope, is those cracks in the system that always shows the malevolent bad guy in the movies who think if they can just squeeze tighter. But the hope is that it's not inevitable, that we can affect the storytelling. And again, we'll have to come back in a few years and be like, hey, here's where we told the story poorly. But the hope is that constant internalized tension that allows us to break system to put them back together, to be iconoclastic to our own sacred tradition, to say there's a more inclusive, wholesome, loving, sustaining, flourishing way to step forward. And this is why that hope can shine in that moment.
No, that's good, man. Um, when you're saying that, like just like when like with peace, like when I like it depends on how we're defining peace. Like, is it more pax romana? Is it more shalom? Like with hope, is the hope that we can like assume the privileges of our society, or is the hope is that things will actually change, like things will actually be overturned, in a sense that there's something, that another world is possible. And I think that's just a really good, like, not that everything needs to, like, obviously I'm what's the word I'm looking for, like creating like dualistic kind of thinking is not necessarily always helpful, but I think in this way of thinking about it, it is putting up kind of different ends on a spectrum, and understanding that, like, as Brian McLaren would say, like, we think that we need to slide to one end of this, either end of the spectrum, but it's really up here. You know what I mean? Kind of like the Brian McLaren stuff from New Kind of Christian.
What you're saying actually is, like, that's what I love about that whole play in the prologue of John. Like, you're right, it links that darkness is the one that's coercive and trying to grasp. And you see darkness going throughout the narrative of John for the coming advent of Jesus, is those who come as gatekeepers, controllers, come at night because they can't let people see that they're asking questions of Jesus. They're the ones that are the soldiers of Rome, because it actually uses Roman soldier instead of temple priest at the end of John. Like, these are all the tools of empire and power that come at night, and they want to control, they want to gatekeep, and they want to grip, to where the only way in is the way of reception. And so, like you said, if we only have hope that we are not affected by the Roman cohort, we get to control the Roman cohort, then yeah, it's a bad hope, because it's kind of like just delayed vengeance. But if we have a hope that one day we can make the Roman soldiers turn swords into plowshares, then there's actually a hope for a new world to come.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I would push it. I would even push that a little bit. I would push the pedal on that even harder, like the gas on that one a little bit harder, and say, not one in one day. Is that, like, we actually hope that Roman soldiers will turn, their swords into plowshares, um, and because we have this hope, we actually do that now as well. Like, we actually live in the midst of that hope, versus it's just a concept that we think will come one day. We enact that one day now.
Which, yeah, very much agree. And I'd say I think that's the important reason why we still gather, why we gather as communities, why we gather as tradition, is to remind ourselves that we begin heating up the metal to bend wrath towards flourishing, to bend sword towards ways to provide for life and to cultivate food for others, to convert power to presence.
I really like this idea of there being a good hope and a bad hope. Realizing that hope is a little more nuanced than we give it. It's like this idea of you having a hope that you'll win the lottery for yourself, or hope that we as humanity could come to fight poverty, and that the people that there wouldn't be financial need with all the resources we have in the world. Um, and I think that hope really, it is affected by what you define life to be, and your standard for life, for humanity. Your hope is only going to be as big as how well you think people should live, or what the world should look like. So you have to really look at what you imagine life to be, or what you imagine life should be, and your hope is going to come from those definitions. And if you don't think that humans deserve certain things, then your hope for a system to change won't be there, because you don't need it. So it's also affected by how much we are wanting and looking for out of life, and how much we're allowing, sort of, even the things we see in scripture, the good parts, to shape like what we imagine God's intention for this world to be. Our hope is directly correlated with that.
If I had to bring our dialogue into one sentence for the day, I would say that peace and hope exist to the degree that we invest ourselves in becoming the community that facilitate the most justice, peace, and hope for those around us. That it can't just be an abstraction, that the whole gift of Advent is the becoming real in each other's lives.
For me, out of the conversation from today, peace is a reminder that without justice, there is no peace, and that looking for peace can sometimes be looking for quiet, sometimes it is looking for disruption. And as for hope, hope is something that is based on how we imagine what God intended the world to be, and that there can be both good hope and bad hope. But when we have the authentic good hope, there is a power within that for our world to change.
For me, I think it boils down to asking these questions of whose peace and whose hope at the end of it. And so it's really important, it's really important that we define our terms, because if we have the wrong peace in mind, then we're going to be saying peace, peace when there is no peace. If we have the wrong hope in mind, we're going to be saying, hey, let's hope for this. And reality is we're just actually pacifying people instead of calling them into a new humanity.